December 15th, 1941. Somewhere near Moscow, Soviet Union. The bitter wind howled across the snow-dusted plains of the Russian wilderness. The ground, frozen solid and treacherous, seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the heavy weight of war. Soviet General Ivan Alexandrovich, his face weathered by years of military service, stood stoically before a group of his senior officers. His eyes narrowed against the freezing gusts, the sharp Russian cold biting through his heavy coat. The landscape before him seemed to reflect the mood in the air, grim, unforgiving, and harsh. "The Americans believe they can win this war with toys," General Alexandrovich muttered, his voice barely audible beneath the roar of the wind. Around him, a small group of Soviet officers stood huddled, trying to shield themselves from the biting cold. They were grumbling, voices tinged with disbelief at the latest reports coming from the Western Allies. American jeeps. These strange, small vehicles, they were told, had been deployed to transport troops, carry supplies, and provide support behind enemy lines. Their simplicity and speed were being hailed as revolutionary in combat, yet to the seasoned officers of the Red Army, it seemed like a joke. The Soviet military had already been pushed to the limit by the relentless assault of Nazi forces across the Eastern Front. Thousands of men had been lost, entire regiments had been decimated, and resources were stretched thin. Tanks and armored vehicles, essential to the Soviet war effort, were scarce and often unreliable in the Russian winter. And now, this. Reports of these bizarre, lightweight vehicles designed by the Americans, offering mobility that the Soviets couldn't even begin to imagine. General Alexandrovich took a long drag from his cigarette, throwing the butt into the snow. He stared down at the document in his hands, a report detailing the performance of the American Jeep. The design was simple four-wheel drive, small enough to navigate through the thickest of mud or the most rugged terrain. But in his eyes, this was nothing more than an impractical novelty. How could such a lightweight, open-air vehicle be effective against the monstrous German war machines that had dominated the Eastern Front? It seemed absurd. "These jeeps are not much more than glorified scouts," one officer remarked, his voice laced with skepticism. "They're not even armored. What good are they when facing tanks or artillery?" Another officer, Lieutenant Dmitry Novikov, spoke with a scoffing tone. "I've seen reports that they can carry only 4 men. How can they be useful on a battlefield like ours? We need heavy armor, not toys." Alexandrovich nodded, his gaze sweeping across the snow-covered landscape. He understood their doubts. His men had been on the front lines since the summer, facing brutal encounters with the Wehrmacht. The idea of something so small, so fragile, performing any significant role seemed laughable. They needed machines built for the harshest conditions, machines that could withstand the punishing weight of war. To them, the Jeep was an impractical distraction, not a tool for victory. Yet, there were murmurs from Moscow, rumors about the American Jeeps performing impressively in the field, especially in the Pacific and North Africa. But how could that possibly apply to the frozen expanse of the Soviet Union? General Alexandrovich brushed the thoughts aside, his mind focused on the reality at hand. He turned to his officers and gave them a stern look. "Our priority is the tanks and artillery. Anything else is a distraction. We will not waste resources on these jeeps." The decision was final. The Jeep would be overlooked, dismissed as a passing fad, an American novelty unworthy of serious consideration. They would stick with what they knew. Or so they thought. January 5th, 1942. A small Soviet outpost, southern Moscow region. The snow was relentless. Thick, heavy flakes fell from the gray sky, blanketing the landscape in a veil of white. The air was so cold that every breath seemed to freeze before it could leave the mouth, and the soldiers stationed at the Soviet outpost struggled to maintain warmth amidst the harsh conditions. Behind a long line of makeshift tents, a group of Soviet supply officers had gathered around a small, inconspicuous vehicle that had arrived just days earlier. It was, of course, an American Jeep, one of the first to be sent to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. In the midst of the chaos and urgency of the war, this small vehicle had been relegated to the role of a mere curiosity, an afterthought amid the flood of tanks, artillery, and trucks. Lieutenant Novikov, now posted to oversee logistics, was one of the few who had shown even the slightest interest in this strange vehicle. He circled it with the same skepticism that had marked his previous comments about the Jeep, still unable to reconcile its size and appearance with its supposed utility. The little Jeep was not more than a few feet high, its thin metal frame painted a dull green that seemed almost out of place in the wintry expanse of the Soviet countryside. It had no armor to speak of, no machine gun mounted on the front, and its engine was modest by Soviet standards. The tires, too, appeared fragile, more suited to a rural farm than the frozen battlefields where men fought and died daily. How could this possibly replace a truck or even a half-track? Novikov muttered, shaking his head. It's a joke. But his commanding officer, Colonel Mikhail Petrov, was less quick to dismiss it. He had received word from Moscow that this vehicle was being tested for a new kind of operation, one that involved speed and maneuverability over heavy firepower. The Jeep's primary task, it seemed, was to traverse the unyielding Russian terrain at a pace no other vehicle could match. Petrov, ever the pragmatic officer, decided to see for himself. "All right, Lieutenant," Petrov said with a grunt. "Start her up. Let's see if this thing can do more than just look foolish." Reluctantly, Novikov slid behind the wheel. The engine started with a throaty roar, and within moments, the Jeep began to move. It was smaller than anything the Soviet military had ever fielded, barely the size of a small car, and the suspension bounced across the uneven ground. But Novikov's skepticism began to waver as he noticed how easily the Jeep weaved through the snowbanks, effortlessly navigating the rough terrain that had turned other vehicles into bogged-down behemoths. "Well, I'll be damned," Novikov muttered under his breath, his eyes widening in surprise. The Jeep's speed and agility were unmatched. While the Soviet trucks and half-tracks, weighed down by armor and heavy loads, struggled to make any headway in the snow, the Jeep danced across the icy ruts like a dancer in the wind. It zipped between fallen trees and over frozen streams, its four-wheel drive providing a kind of sure-footedness that left the heavier vehicles in the dust. Petrov, watching from a distance, scratched his chin. He had seen many types of vehicles in his time, but this was something else entirely. There was no denying its efficiency. As the Jeep tore through the field at speeds that no other vehicle could achieve, the Soviet officers exchanged looks of stunned disbelief. By the time the test concluded, Novikov was beginning to understand why the Americans might be so adamant about the utility of this toy. The Jeep had far more potential than anyone had initially imagined. It could move faster, farther, and more efficiently than many of the standard military vehicles currently in use. And in a war where mobility was often the key to survival, this little vehicle was proving its worth. "All right, Lieutenant," Petrov said, turning to Novikov. "Let's see if it can handle more than just reconnaissance." The Jeep's trial was far from over. But it had already begun to show that it was more than just a curiosity. It was a tool that could help Soviet forces in ways that their existing vehicles, no matter how formidable, could not. February 22, 1942, near Tula, Soviet Union. The wind howled again, relentless and biting, as the Soviet soldiers braced themselves for yet another day in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. At this point, the struggle for Tula had become a bitter stalemate, and morale was at an all-time low. The Soviets had been fighting desperately to halt the German advance, but the roads were clogged with snow and mud, and their supply lines were stretched thin. The roads that might have been highways to victory were instead death traps, where trucks and heavy vehicles often bogged down or broke down, unable to maneuver in the terrible conditions. But today, something was different. A convoy of Soviet Jeeps, several of the American vehicles that had recently arrived, snaked its way through the rough terrain, cutting across snowy hillsides with remarkable speed and precision. Leading the charge was Lieutenant Novikov, his eyes focused on the narrow trail ahead. Behind him, the rest of the convoy followed in quick succession. The Jeeps were carrying vital supplies, ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the frontline positions, a task that, in any other vehicle, would have taken far longer and been far more dangerous. This time, the convoy was not hindered by the deep snowdrifts that had swallowed up the larger Soviet trucks. Unlike the heavy half-tracks, the Jeeps skimmed across the surface of the snow, their four-wheel drive systems providing traction even in the most treacherous conditions. The Jeep's agility allowed them to easily bypass obstacles that would have otherwise stranded slower vehicles. As they approached a frozen river crossing, Novikov saw a German machine gun nest positioned just ahead, hidden in the snowbank. There was no time to take the long, circuitous route to avoid the enemy position. Novikov made a snap decision. "Shift into high gear, and let's move," he ordered. The Jeep shot forward, dodging between trees, the snow kicking up in all directions. With a powerful burst of speed, Novikov's jeep broke through the riverbank and charged toward the enemy. The Germans had no time to react before the jeep reached them, and Novikov was able to launch a quick assault on the machine gunner, disabling the position within seconds. The others in the convoy followed suit, clearing the way in a fluid, almost seamless motion. The jeep, which had once seemed like a curious experiment to be dismissed, was now proving itself a crucial asset to the Soviet war effort. It was no longer just a toy, it was a game-changer. As the convoy pushed forward, Novikov reflected on the skepticism that had surrounded these vehicles just a few months earlier. The Soviet generals had called them impractical. They had been written off as novelties, but the reality of war had a way of changing perspectives. In the Russian winter, where traditional supply routes were often impassable and larger vehicles struggled to make headway, the jeep's versatility had proven invaluable. It could move faster, navigate more easily, and carry crucial supplies to where they were needed most. Even more impressively, the jeeps were proving their worth as mobile attack units. Though they lacked the firepower of the Soviet T-34 or the heavier artillery, the jeep's speed and maneuverability allowed them to outflank German positions, launch quick raids, and hit targets of opportunity with devastating effect. And it was not just Novikov who was beginning to realize the jeep's value. Word had spread quickly through the ranks, and soon, Soviet commanders at all levels began requesting more of these American vehicles. It wasn't just the frontline soldiers who were seeing the jeep's potential. Back at the rear lines, the logistics officers were amazed by how easily the vehicles could transport supplies and medical personnel to where they were needed. No longer were convoys of heavy trucks needed to transport goods through the snow. Instead, a fleet of jeeps could move quickly, allowing supplies to reach their destination in record time. The transformation was undeniable. The American jeep, once dismissed as a joke, had now become an indispensable tool in the Soviet war effort. And for General Alexandrovich, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics of the vehicle, the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. March 12, 1942. Soviet Military Headquarters, Moscow. Inside the cold, dimly lit headquarters in Moscow, the air was thick with the tension of impending decisions. The room was filled with Soviet generals, their faces lined with exhaustion from months of unrelenting warfare. Maps covered the walls, littered with pushpins and red markers that tracked the movements of the German forces. But today, the focus of the meeting was not on tanks or artillery, it was on the jeeps. General Alexandrovich stood at the head of the table, his usually composed face now showing a hint of frustration. The reports flooding in from the front lines could no longer be ignored. The American jeeps had proven themselves in combat time and again. They were outpacing the heavy trucks, getting through snow and mud, and delivering supplies when the situation seemed hopeless. But the reports also detailed something that no one had expected. The jeeps were being used in combat operations, not just logistical support. A map laid out before them showed the advances made by Soviet units in the harsh winter conditions, particularly in areas where traditional vehicles had faltered. The jeep had become a key tool for the Red Army, a force multiplier that allowed Soviet troops to exploit weaknesses in the German lines and perform hit-and-run attacks with unprecedented speed. Alexandrovich was quiet, his eyes scanning the reports. He had been one of the loudest voices against the jeep, deeming it a foolish distraction that had no place on the Eastern Front. But now, there was no denying it. The small, simple vehicle had outperformed their expectations. It had proven far more useful than anyone had ever imagined, and the time had come to acknowledge that. As the meeting began, Colonel Petrov, who had seen the jeeps in action firsthand, took the floor. "Comrades," Petrov began, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the reality they faced, "we've been reluctant to accept it, but the truth is clear. These American jeeps are more than just a logistical tool, they're a tactical asset. They can outrun our armored vehicles, slip through terrain that would leave our trucks stranded, and carry out operations that would be impossible for heavier machines." The room was silent as the other generals exchanged uncertain glances. It was rare for any officer to openly challenge the assumptions of a Soviet command structure that prided itself on its resilience and adaptability, but the evidence was irrefutable. Alexandrovich remained still, his gaze fixed on the map, his fingers pressing against the edges in deep thought. General Mikhail Sokolov, one of the older officers, broke the silence. "This cannot be true. We are talking about a tiny vehicle, barely large enough to carry a squad of men. How can it stand up to the power of the German panzer divisions, or the heavy artillery we need to break their lines? Petrov shook his head, his expression grim but resolute. It's not about standing up to the panzer divisions, it's about mobility. It's about the ability to strike quickly, move supplies efficiently, and strike at weak points before the enemy can react. This Jeep can do all of that. There was a long pause before General Alexandrovich spoke, his voice low but resolute. You're right. I've seen the reports from the front. The Jeep has outperformed our expectations in ways that no one could have imagined. He paused, as if allowing himself a moment of rare concession. It's time we reassess our approach. The Jeep has earned its place on the battlefield. The generals exchanged looks, each of them processing the reality of the situation. The decision was clear: Soviet commanders would need to adapt and integrate this new asset into their operations. And perhaps, for the first time in the war, they would have to admit that something designed by the Americans was making a real difference. I will instruct our commanders to begin using the Jeeps in combat operations more extensively, Alexandrovich continued. We need to embrace this new approach, or we risk falling behind. The war is not just about firepower, it's about movement, speed, and adaptability. If the Jeep can help us achieve that, then we will use it. The meeting ended soon after, and as the generals filed out of the room, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. The Soviet Union had long been focused on brute force: the heavy artillery, the massed infantry, the armored tanks. But the Jeep was something different. It was small, nimble, and most of all effective. For the first time since the Soviet Army had rejected the idea, the Jeep had been fully accepted into the ranks, not as a novelty, but as a tool of war. In the months that followed, the Jeep would continue to prove itself across the vast expanse of the Eastern Front. It would be used to transport men, evacuate the wounded, deliver ammunition, and execute lightning-fast strikes. What had once been dismissed as an American experiment had become an integral part of the Soviet war effort. And as General Alexandrovich stood in the bitter Russian cold, watching the little Jeeps move across the terrain with incredible speed, he could not help but think back to that fateful winter day when he had dismissed them as useless. The war had a way of changing perception sometimes. A small vehicle was all it took to shift the tide of battle. August 9, 1943. The outskirts of Kursk, Soviet Union. The battle for Kursk, one of the largest and bloodiest clashes of World War II, was in full swing. The air was thick with the sounds of artillery fire and the deep rumble of tanks advancing on both sides. In the midst of the chaos, where massive Soviet T-34 seconds and German panzers clashed in brutal combat, a quieter, smaller force was moving through the rear lines, a convoy of Jeeps, their engines humming steadily as they carried troops, supplies, and vital communications between forward units. Lieutenant Novikov, now a battle-hardened officer who had seen the evolution of the Jeep firsthand, stood at the head of a small convoy of the American vehicles. He had grown accustomed to the sight of them weaving through the mud and snow of the Russian countryside, but there was something different today. The Jeeps were no longer simply an auxiliary vehicle, they had become a core part of the Soviet war effort, indispensable for the operations around Kursk. As Novikov looked out over the battlefield, his mind reflected on how far things had come. The Jeep, once dismissed as an unnecessary distraction, was now woven into the fabric of Soviet military operations. It had proven itself as more than just a light transport vehicle, it was a tool for combat and logistics, a force multiplier that allowed Soviet commanders to extend their reach on the battlefield and maintain an unmatched level of mobility. The Battle of Kursk was a turning point in the war, and in many ways, the Jeep's contribution was emblematic of the Soviet Union's broader shift in military strategy. While the heavy armor of the T-34 and the massed Soviet artillery were the headline weapons of the conflict, the Jeeps had allowed for a more nimble and adaptive approach, crucial for the fast-moving fluid operations that were beginning to dominate the Eastern Front. Novikov's convoy made its way toward the front, moving effortlessly through the broken terrain, while other units mired in the mud, stuck in the trenches, watched enviously. The Jeeps could dart between positions, link up with scattered squads, and deliver critical supplies, all without the encumbrance of larger vehicles. Their speed allowed Soviet commanders to exploit openings in the enemy's defenses before the Germans could react. As the convoy approached the command post, Novikov was approached by a senior officer. "Lieutenant," the officer said with a tired but appreciative smile, "the supply lines are holding thanks to your Jeeps. The men are getting what they need, and the enemy hasn't been able to slow you down. It was a small victory, but it was one that would have been impossible without the Jeeps. It had taken time, months of skepticism, adaptation, and trial, but now the Soviet army had learned to exploit the Jeep's full potential. It wasn't just a utility vehicle anymore. It was an integral part of Soviet tactics, capable of keeping pace with the rapidly changing nature of modern warfare. In the months that followed Kursk, the Jeep would continue to prove its worth, operating in roles that ranged from reconnaissance and raiding missions to evacuation and rescue operations. By the time the Soviet army began its massive counteroffensive in the summer of 1944, the Jeeps had become ubiquitous, moving through the lines with remarkable efficiency. They had become a symbol of the adaptability that the Soviet forces had been forced to adopt in the face of the Nazi onslaught. General Alexandrovich, who had once ridiculed the idea of using the American Jeep, was now one of its biggest advocates. He had seen the value of speed and flexibility, qualities that the Jeep embodied. He had seen the way the vehicle could operate behind enemy lines, bringing supplies where they were needed most, evacuating the wounded, and providing a level of mobility that was impossible with traditional Soviet vehicles. Speed, mobility, and adaptability, Alexandrovich said during one of his many briefings, these are the qualities that will win this war. And the Jeep is proof of that. The legacy of the Jeep, however, extended beyond the Eastern Front. As the war in Europe wound toward its conclusion, the lessons learned from the Soviet adoption of the Jeep would influence military strategies in future conflicts. The concept of fast, flexible vehicles for reconnaissance, logistical support, and rapid strikes would become a core element of modern military doctrine. For the Soviets, the Jeep's role in the war had changed the way they thought about mobility on the battlefield. It had proven that even the smallest, most unassuming vehicle could have a profound impact on the outcome of a battle, especially in a war where speed and surprise often made the difference between life and death. The American Jeep, once dismissed by Soviet generals as a laughable curiosity, had become a silent hero of the war effort. It had earned its place in history not through overwhelming firepower or grandiose tactics, but through sheer versatility and the ability to adapt to the ever-changing demands of war. As the Soviet Union marched toward victory, General Alexandrovich couldn't help but think back to that fateful day when the Jeep had first arrived, dismissed by his officers as a useless trinket. He smiled grimly, knowing that the vehicle had played a vital role in the victory that was now within reach. The Jeep had proven them wrong.